Deep in the Olympic National Forest, photographer Daniel Hayes finds himself caught in a raging storm, seeking shelter in a cave, only to come face to face with an injured mother grizzly bear. What happens next defies all expectations. In this inspiring story, Daniel takes a leap of faith, helping the wounded bear despite the risks. But the real shock comes when he discovers she isn't alone. Her cub is nearby, depending on her survival. As Daniel fights to find help, he faces the ultimate test, a dangerous encounter with a male grizzly, a brutal standoff that could mean life or death. Through courage, trust, and an unspoken understanding, this experience changes Daniel forever. This is more than just a tale of survival. It's an inspiring story about the fragile connection between humans and wildlife, the strength of a mother's love, and the unexpected moments that leave a lasting mark on our hearts. If this inspiring story of loyalty, resilience, and redemption moves you, be sure to listen to the full video to experience every breathtaking moment. Don't miss this inspiring story of survival, courage, and deep emotional connection. The wind howled through the towering pines of Yellowstone National Park, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant growl of thunder. Daniel Hayes, a seasoned wildlife photographer, adjusted the straps of his backpack and pressed forward, his boots crunching against the damp earth of the Lamar Valley Trail. What had begun as a routine trip to capture the breathtaking beauty of Yellowstone's wilderness was now turning into a battle against nature itself. He had seen the storm forming in the distance, a dark mass creeping across the sky like an ominous shadow, but he had underestimated its speed. The forecast had predicted light showers, nothing he wasn't used to. But now, as the first heavy drops of rain struck his jacket and the temperature plummeted, Daniel knew he had made a mistake. The rain came fast and hard, drumming against the trees, soaking his clothes, and turning the once solid trail into a slippery mess of mud and roots. The wind picked up, sending leaves swirling like ghostly figures in the dim light. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the rugged landscape for a fleeting second before plunging it back into darkness. Daniel was miles from his campsite, too far to turn back. The nearest ranger station was at least 5 miles east. An impossible trek in these conditions. He had to find shelter, and fast. His eyes scanned the terrain, searching for anything that could shield him from the relentless storm. That's when he saw it. Nestled between a jagged rock formation and a thick stand of cedar trees was a cave, its mouth dark and yawning like the entrance to another world. The primal part of Daniel's mind screamed caution. Caves in Yellowstone weren't exactly unoccupied. But another gust of icy wind and a fresh crack of thunder left him with little choice. Survival instincts overrode hesitation. He sprinted toward the cave, his heart pounding with adrenaline. The moment he stepped inside, the world outside vanished into a wall of sound and fury, rain lashing the rocky ground just feet from where he now stood. He was safe. Or so he thought. The cave was dark but not silent. A deep rumbling noise reverberated from within. Not thunder, not the wind, something else. Daniel's pulse spiked. He swallowed hard and slowly reached for his flashlight. He clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the damp stone walls, the scattered remains of dried leaves and fur. His breath caught in his throat. Then, at the far end of the cave, something moved. The massive form shifted slightly, 2 glowing eyes catching the light. A low, deliberate exhale filled the space. Daniel froze. Lying just feet away from him was a grizzly bear. Its massive frame sprawled across the ground, its chest rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. And then he saw it. A deep, jagged wound stretched across the bear's shoulder, fresh blood still dark against its matted fur. Daniel had entered the cave to escape danger, but now he was staring right into its eyes. Daniel didn't move. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The flashlight trembled slightly in his grip as he tried to process the situation. A grizzly bear, injured, cornered, lying just a few feet away. His instinct screamed at him to back away slowly, to get out while he still could. But the storm outside was raging, the wind howling through the cave's entrance, carrying sheets of rain that crashed against the rocks. There was nowhere to go. The bear's eyes locked onto his, dark pools of something ancient and unreadable. It didn't snarl, it didn't lunge, it simply watched him. Daniel had spent years photographing wildlife, learning their movements, their behaviors, their silent rules of survival. He had been close to bears before, but always from behind a lens, always with an escape route. This was different. His gaze flickered to the wound on the bear's shoulder, a long, jagged gash, still fresh, dark with blood. He didn't know if it had been the result of a fight with another bear, a fall, or something else. But one thing was clear. It was bad. The bear's breathing was labored, uneven, as if every inhale took effort. It was hurt, weak, and for the first time Daniel realized something that sent a shiver down his spine. If this bear wanted to attack him, it already would have. Instead, it lay still, watching, not as a predator eyeing prey, but as an animal assessing a threat. Daniel lowered his flashlight slowly, trying to make himself look less intimidating. His movements were measured, careful. He knew that sudden gestures could trigger something primal. "Easy," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The words weren't for the bear, not really. They were for himself. The bear's ears flicked slightly, but it didn't move. Daniel swallowed hard. He had a choice to make. He could sit in the corner, wait out the storm, and pray the bear left him alone. Or he could do something completely insane. His fingers hesitated over the strap of his backpack. Inside, he always carried a small first aid kit, not meant for treating wild animals, of course, but for emergencies. This was an emergency. The logical part of his brain screamed, "This is a wild bear, leave it alone." But another part, the part that had spent years watching these creatures through a camera lens, marveling at their strength, their raw existence, refused to ignore what was right in front of him. Daniel exhaled slowly and made a decision. With painstaking caution, he reached into his bag. The bear's nostrils flared slightly, its muscles tensing at the movement. Daniel froze. Several agonizing seconds passed. Then the bear relaxed again. Daniel pulled out the first aid kit, unzipping it quietly. It wasn't much, some antiseptic wipes, gauze, a roll of medical tape. Definitely not enough for a wound like this. He debated his next move. The bear wasn't unconscious, but it was weak. Could he even get close enough to help without making it panic? Another gust of wind screamed through the cave, carrying the sharp scent of rain and pine. The bear exhaled, shifting slightly, wincing as it moved. Daniel took the smallest step forward. The bear growled, low, deep, a warning. Daniel stopped. His pulse thundered. One wrong move and this ends badly. All right, he murmured, barely above the sound of the storm. I get it. No sudden moves. He took another step. The bear's eyes never left him, but it didn't growl again. Daniel knelt just a few feet away, close enough to smell the damp earth clinging to the bear's fur, close enough to see the pain in its breathing. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. His hands trembled slightly as he tore open an antiseptic wipe. The sharp, sterile scent filled the cave, a stark contrast to the musty smell of stone and wet fur. He hesitated. Then, carefully, he reached out and touched the edge of the wound. The bear flinched violently, a deep snarl vibrating through its chest. Daniel yanked his hand back, heart slamming against his ribs. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the bear let out a slow, deep exhale. It was still watching him, still wary, but it didn't lash out. It didn't try to move away. Daniel swallowed hard. He reached out again, slower this time. The antiseptic wipe touched the wound. The bear flinched again, but not as violently. "Yeah," Daniel whispered. "I know. Stings like hell." He cleaned the wound as best he could, his hands shaking slightly with every careful swipe of the cloth. The bear grumbled low in its throat, but it didn't stop him. Daniel worked quickly, wrapping what little gauze he had around the wound, tying it off with medical tape. When he finally sat back, his legs were shaking from both fear and exhaustion. The bear huffed softly, its massive head resting against the ground. Its breathing was still uneven, but there was something else now. Relief. Daniel exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. For the first time since stepping into the cave, he felt something shift between them. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. And the bear wasn't just a wild animal. They were two creatures caught in the same storm, surviving the only way they knew how. Outside, the wind continued to scream, the rain lashing against the rocks. But inside the cave, something far rarer had begun to take shape. A fragile, unspoken trust. The storm raged through the night, its howling winds and hammering rain creating a constant symphony of chaos outside the cave. But inside, in the dim glow of his fading flashlight, Daniel Hayes sat with his back against the cold stone wall, his pulse finally slowing after the harrowing encounter. The grizzly lay still, its massive body rising and falling with slow, uneven breaths. The crude bandage Daniel had applied clung to its shoulder, darkened with blood, but holding firm. He still couldn't believe what he had done. Every fiber of his survival instincts had screamed at him to stay back, to not interfere with a wild predator. But here he was, alone in a cave with a wounded grizzly bear, hoping he had made the right decision. Daniel shifted slightly, careful not to make any sudden movements. His legs ached from crouching, and exhaustion pressed down on him like a heavy weight. He checked his watch. 3:42 a.m. The storm had been raging for hours. The bear huffed in its sleep, shifting slightly. Daniel held his breath, watching as its ears flicked and its nostrils flared. Even in rest, it was alert. He let his head fall back against the stone, allowing his mind to wander. He thought of the photographs he had taken over the years, the wildlife he had admired from a safe distance. He had spent so much time capturing the beauty of nature. But this was something entirely different. Just as his body began to relax, a noise snapped him back to full alertness. It was faint, almost lost beneath the wind and rain, but it was there. A rustling. Daniel stiffened. He slowly turned his head toward the entrance of the cave, straining to see through the inky blackness beyond the curtain of rain. Nothing. He frowned. Had he imagined it? The wind was strong. Maybe it had been a branch shifting, a pile of leaves skittering across the rocks. Then he heard it again. Closer this time. A low, pitiful whimper. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. That sound. It wasn't the wind. His eyes darted back to the grizzly. It hadn't moved, but its ears were now pricked, its body tense. It had heard it too. The cave was no longer just a refuge. Something, or someone, was out there. Slowly, carefully, Daniel grabbed his flashlight, pressing the button to turn it on. A weak beam flickered to life, barely cutting through the darkness. He aimed it toward the entrance. At first he saw nothing but the rain, the ground slick with water and glistening in the dim light. Then, movement. Daniel's breath caught. A small, shivering figure stood just outside the cave, barely visible through the storm. It took a hesitant step forward, its tiny paws sinking slightly into the wet earth. A bear cub. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. The cub was young, no more than a few months old, its brown fur soaked from the rain, clinging to its small frame. Its eyes, round and full of fear, darted toward him, then toward the wounded bear. Daniel's stomach twisted. It wasn't just a bear. It was her cub. He suddenly understood. The mother bear hadn't been fighting just to survive. She had been fighting for her cub. The realization sent a wave of emotions crashing over him. He had thought she was alone, just another injured animal in the wild, struggling against the forces of nature. But she had a reason to survive. And now that cub was here, weak, terrified, and searching for its mother. Daniel turned his gaze back to the mother bear. She was awake. Her eyes were open now, locked onto the cub. She let out a deep, rumbling exhale, a sound that carried exhaustion, relief, and something else. An unbreakable bond. The cub hesitated at the edge of the cave, ears flattened against its head. Its tiny body quivered as it sniffed the air, sensing both its mother and an unfamiliar presence. Daniel didn't move. The last thing he wanted to do was startle the cub or make the mother bear feel threatened. Even in her weakened state, she was still dangerous. The cub let out another soft whimper. Then, tentatively, it stepped forward. Daniel's pulse pounded as he watched the tiny creature pad across the damp ground, inching closer to its mother. The moment it reached her, the cub nudged its snout against her fur, a desperate, silent plea for comfort. The mother bear rumbled softly, her body still tense but her eyes softening. She lifted her head just enough to nuzzle the cub, reassuring it despite her pain. Daniel exhaled slowly, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. It was raw, it was primal, it was motherhood in its purest form. The cub buried itself against its mother's massive frame, curling into the warmth of her fur. Its tiny body still trembled, but there was relief in its movements now. Daniel felt his throat tighten. For all the fear he had experienced tonight, for all the danger he still faced, this moment was something extraordinary. A bond forged by survival, tested by nature, and made unbreakable by love. The rain continued to pour outside. The storm had not yet passed. But in this cave, a different battle had already been fought. And for now, against all odds, the mother and cub had won. Daniel Hayes had always considered himself an observer of nature, a silent witness behind the lens of his camera. He had spent years capturing the raw beauty of the wild, predators stalking prey, the changing of the seasons, the quiet solitude of the untamed world. But now he was a part of it. Sitting in the damp, dimly lit cave, he watched the mother bear and her cub nestled together. The cub had finally stopped shivering, its tiny body pressed against its mother's massive form. The mother bear, still weak, let out slow, rhythmic breaths. But she was alive. And yet, Daniel knew that wouldn't last. Her wound was bad, infection was a real threat. Without proper treatment, she might not make it, and if she didn't, the cub wouldn't survive on its own. Daniel swallowed hard. He had done what he could. He had cleaned the wound, bandaged it as best he could. But he wasn't a veterinarian, and he sure as hell wasn't a wildlife expert. If he wanted to truly help them, he needed to get out of this cave and find someone who could. The problem? He was miles from the nearest ranger station. And outside, the storm still raged. The wind howled through the trees, carrying sheets of rain that slashed against the rocks like tiny daggers. The trails would be treacherous, muddy, slick, nearly impossible to navigate. But what choice did he have? He glanced at the bears one last time. The mother's eyes were closed, but she wasn't asleep. He could tell by the way her ears twitched, by the faint rise and fall of her breath. She was aware of him, even now. The cub shifted slightly, letting out a soft whimper before tucking its head into its mother's fur. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just another wildlife encounter. This was life and death. Taking a slow, steady breath, he reached for his backpack. If he was going to do this, he needed to move now. Into the storm. The moment Daniel stepped outside, the wind hit him like a freight train. His jacket, already damp, was instantly soaked through. The rain came in relentless sheets, blurring the world around him. The ground beneath his boots was slick, the mud pulling at him with every step. He hunched his shoulders against the wind and forced himself forward. The path back to the main trail was already half flooded. The once firm dirt had turned into a slippery, treacherous mess. Every step felt uncertain, every rock an obstacle waiting to send him tumbling. But he kept going. He had to. Lightning flashed overhead. followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder so loud it rattled his ribs. Daniel's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He wasn't just fighting the storm, he was fighting time. The longer he stayed out here, the greater the risk of getting lost, injured, or worse. But turning back meant leaving the bears to their fate. And that wasn't an option. The first signs of danger. About a mile into his trek, something made Daniel stop. At first, he wasn't sure what had caught his attention, but then he saw it. Deep, heavy tracks in the mud. Not his, and not the mother bear's. Something else had been through here. His stomach clenched. Another bear? A predator? He crouched down, running his fingers over the edges of the prints. They were fresh, too fresh. The rain hadn't washed them away yet, which meant whatever had made them was still close. Daniel's pulse quickened. He wasn't alone out here. A gust of wind sent a branch crashing to the ground nearby, making him jolt. His eyes darted toward the trees, scanning the shadows between them. Nothing. Just the storm. Just the forest. Just his own damn paranoia. Daniel forced himself to stand and pushed forward, but his senses were on high alert now. If there was another animal out here, especially another bear, he needed to be careful. A race against time. The hours bled together. The storm showed no signs of easing, and Daniel's body was screaming in protest. His legs ached, his boots were caked in mud, and his hands were frozen stiff. But then, a break in the trees. His breath hitched as he spotted something through the rain. A building, small, wooden, nestled against the edge of the tree line, the ranger station. Relief crashed over him so hard he almost laughed. He picked up his pace, half jogging the last few hundred yards until he reached the door. His fingers fumbled against the wood as he knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time. Then, finally, movement. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s, her expression sharp and skeptical. She was tall, weathered, with piercing blue eyes that looked like they had seen everything this wilderness had to offer. Her ranger badge caught the light. "Hell of a night to be out, kid," she said, arms crossed. "You look half drowned." Daniel didn't waste time. "I need your help," he said, his voice hoarse. "There's an injured grizzly, a mother, and she has a cub." That got her attention. Her brow furrowed. "Where?" Daniel gave her everything, the cave's location, the mother's wound, the cub's presence, the fresh tracks he had seen in the mud. The woman's expression darkened. "You did the right thing coming here," she said, stepping back and grabbing a radio from the desk. "We've got a wildlife rehab team stationed nearby. We'll get them mobilized." Daniel nodded, but the weight in his chest didn't ease. Time was slipping away too fast. And all he could do now was pray he had made it in time. The ranger station was alive with urgency. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the weight of the storm still lingered in the air. Every second felt like an eternity as the wildlife rescue team prepared their gear, tranquilizer rifles, medical kits, and radio equipment crackling with updates from other rangers in the area. Daniel paced near the door, his hands clenched into fists. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind was racing. Were the bears still safe? Had the mother survived the last few hours? A sharp voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Let's move," Susan Carter, the lead ranger, barked as she slung a rifle over her shoulder. She was calm but intense, the kind of person who had seen too many close calls in the wild. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gear and followed the team into the storm-drenched wilderness. The tracks in the mud. The hike back was brutal. The rain had turned the trails into a slick, uneven mess, making every step a challenge. But Daniel barely noticed. His focus was locked on the fresh tracks in the mud. Deep, heavy paw prints. Not from the mother bear, not from the cub. Something else had been through here. "Grizzly," one of the wildlife specialists, Jack Thornton, murmured as he crouched near the prints. "And a big one." Daniel's stomach twisted into a knot. The mother bear was already injured and weak, If a male grizzly had picked up her scent, this could turn deadly fast. Jack stood, gripping his rifle tighter. If it's a dominant male, it might see the cub as a threat, could try to take it out. Daniel's heart pounded. What? Why? Jack's expression was grim. Male grizzlies sometimes kill cubs that aren't theirs. It forces the mother into another mating cycle. Daniel felt sick. He had spent the last day fighting to protect these bears. He couldn't let it end like this. Susan's radio crackled. Moving into position, another ranger's voice came through. We'll circle from the west. Susan glanced at Daniel. Stay behind us. If things go south, we handle it. Daniel nodded, but he wasn't sure he could just stand back and watch. The clearing, a fight for survival. They reached the cave's clearing just as the scene unfolded. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The mother bear stood at the center, her injured shoulders sagging, her massive form angled protectively in front of the cub. Opposite her, a massive male grizzly. It was at least twice the size of the cub, its fur dark and thick, its posture dominant and unyielding. The mother bear let out a warning roar, her voice raw and strained. The cub whimpered, pressing itself closer to her side. Daniel barely breathed. The male took a step forward. The mother didn't back down. Despite her wound, despite her exhaustion, she stood her ground. The male bared its teeth, growling deep in its throat. Susan raised her tranquilizer rifle, but Jack held up a hand. Not yet. Daniel clenched his fists. Are you insane? She's hurt. She can't fight. Jack's voice was low. She has to try. Daniel felt helpless. If she lost this fight, the cub would be defenseless. The male charged. The mother roared, swiping with her good paw, but the wound on her shoulder slowed her down. The male slammed into her, sending her skidding across the mud. The cub screeched in terror. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it as hard as he could toward the male bear. Hey! He shouted. The rock struck the male's flank, barely more than a distraction, but it was enough. The massive grizzly whipped its head toward Daniel, nostrils flaring, eyes dark with rage. Susan cursed. Are you trying to get yourself killed? But Daniel's gamble worked. The mother bear used the distraction to lunge, sinking her teeth into the male's shoulder. The male roared in pain and staggered back, shaking her off. He was bigger, stronger, but the mother had something more powerful than brute force. She had something to protect. She charged again, this time catching the male off guard. Her claws raked across his face, a deep wound opening just above his eye. The male let out an enraged snarl, but he hesitated. For the first time, he reconsidered the fight. And in the wild, hesitation could be everything. Jack didn't wait. He lifted the tranquilizer rifle and fired. The dart sank into the male's shoulder. The big grizzly staggered, shaking his head violently. He turned toward them, nostrils flaring. Then his movement slowed. Seconds later, he collapsed. The clearing went dead silent. The only sound was the mother's heavy breathing. A silent understanding. Daniel let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The mother bear stood over her cub, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion. Blood stained her fur, but she was still standing. Susan lowered her rifle, exhaling. That was too damn close. Jack checked the male. He'll be out for a while. We'll move him somewhere safe before he wakes up. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off the mother bear. She looked at him, and for a single moment, just a breath in time, Daniel swore he saw something in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, an understanding, a connection. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed. The mother bear let out a soft rumble, nudged her cub closer, and turned away. She had won the fight, but her battle for survival was far from over. And Daniel knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving them now. The storm had passed. But the forest was still heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The male grizzly lay sedated, his massive form sprawled in the mud, his breath slow and steady. The wildlife team worked quickly, preparing to relocate him deep into the wilderness where he would awaken far from the mother and cub. Daniel barely noticed. His gaze remained locked on the mother bear. She was exhausted but still standing, her massive frame tense, her cub pressed close to her uninjured side. The fight had taken everything out of her. Blood darkened the damp fur on her shoulder, her breaths ragged. And yet, she had won. She had protected her cub against impossible odds, and Daniel had never seen anything more powerful. A moment of stillness. He took a slow step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The cub let out a small whimper, its wide eyes flicking between its mother and the human who had, somehow, become part of their world. The mother bear's dark gaze lifted to meet Daniel's. His breath caught. This close he could see the details in her eyes. Deep, rich pools of brown, filled with something ancient and knowing. There was no fear in them, no immediate aggression, just understanding. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind rustled through the trees, sending droplets of water cascading from the branches. The forest felt eerily quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. Daniel slowly crouched, lowering himself to the mother bear's level. He kept his movements deliberate, careful. "I don't know if you can understand me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I hope you know, I wasn't trying to hurt you." The mother bear huffed a slow, deliberate exhale. Not a growl, not a warning, something else. A response. Daniel swallowed hard. He had been around wildlife long enough to know that this was something rare. This wasn't just an animal tolerating his presence. This was recognition. She knew who he was. She knew what he had done. The cub's curiosity. A small movement caught Daniel's eye. The cubit, small, cautious but undeniably curious, had taken a single step toward him. Daniel held his breath. The mother bear didn't stop it. The cub sniffed the air, its tiny black nose twitching, ears perked forward. It had never known humans, had never been this close to one before. And yet, it wasn't afraid. The cub stepped closer. Daniel's fingers instinctively tightened around the strap of his backpack. One wrong move, and the mother could change her mind. But she didn't. She watched, calm but alert, as her cub inched toward the human who had been there when they needed him most. The cub stopped just a few feet away, tilting its head. Daniel's heart pounded. The urge to reach out was overwhelming. But he didn't. He let the cub decide the distance. It took one more step, then another, sniffing the air again, before looking back at its mother. The mother bear let out a low, soft rumble. Not a warning, but an acknowledgement. Daniel's chest tightened. The cub hesitated, then took one last step forward. It was close enough to touch. Daniel didn't move. And then, as quickly as it had approached, the cub turned and scurried back to its mother's side. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers loosening, his pulse finally steadying. That had been enough. More than enough. A silent goodbye. The wildlife team had finished their preparations. The male grizzly would be transported away, giving the mother and cub the best possible chance of survival. Susan approached Daniel, her boots crunching against the wet ground. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," she murmured, "but I've never seen that." Daniel glanced at her, then back at the mother bear. "Neither have I." Susan studied him. "You know she's not going to stay here forever." Daniel nodded. He knew. "She'll move on once she's strong enough," Susan continued. "Take the cub with her. It's what they do." Daniel's throat tightened. He knew this moment wouldn't last. It couldn't. But that didn't make it any easier. He looked back at the mother bear. She was watching him one last time. For a single breath in time, everything slowed. This wasn't a bear trapped in survival mode. This wasn't a wild animal reacting on instinct. This was something else entirely. A moment that only the two of them would ever truly understand. Daniel lifted his hand, not to wave, not to gesture, but simply as a sign of respect. The mother bear blinked slowly. Then, finally, she turned. The cub followed, its tiny form padding through the damp earth as they disappeared into the trees. Daniel watched until there was nothing left to see. Then he let out a slow, shaky breath and turned back toward the team. It was over, but somehow, he knew he would never forget. More than just a story. By the time Daniel made it back to the ranger station, dawn was beginning to break. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink, the storm long gone. He didn't feel cold anymore. Didn't feel exhausted. He only felt choked. The photos he had taken over the years had always told stories. But this was more than a story. It was a connection, one that most people would never get to experience. As he sat near the station's porch, staring out at the wild, untamed beauty of the forest, he found himself smiling. Somewhere out there, the mother bear and her cub were continuing their journey. And Daniel knew that, no matter what, he had been a part of it. A part of something bigger than himself. Something wild. Something unforgettable. And maybe, just maybe, something that wasn't over just yet. The days that followed the standoff were filled with a strange stillness. The storm had passed, leaving the Olympic National Forest glistening with fresh rain, its trails soaked but peaceful. The world that had once felt chaotic, wild, and on the edge of disaster now seemed calmer. But Daniel knew the quiet wouldn't last. The mother bear was getting stronger. Each morning from a safe distance, Daniel watched her. Her movements had changed. Where she had once struggled to lift herself, she now stood with more confidence. The stiffness in her injured shoulder had started to fade. She was still careful, still favoring her uninjured side, but there was strength returning to her steps. And the cub? The cub was thriving. Every day it grew bolder, wandering further from its mother, though never too far. It chased insects through the underbrush, pawed at leaves, and tested its tiny claws on fallen logs. It was learning how to be wild. And Daniel knew they wouldn't stay much longer. The final morning. The sun had barely risen when Daniel woke to a familiar rustling outside his tent. His body ached from the past few days, the long hikes, the sleepless nights, the adrenaline that had never quite left his system. But something felt different this morning. Quieter. He stepped out, stretching, and turned toward the clearing where the bears had spent most of their time. And then he saw them. The mother bear was standing at the edge of the forest, her cub beside her. Daniel's breath caught. She was leaving. For a moment he felt frozen, caught between the deep bond he had formed with these creatures and the undeniable truth that they were never his to keep. This had always been the way of the wild. The mother bear had come here seeking shelter, wounded and vulnerable. She had found temporary refuge, a brief moment of safety in a world that was never truly safe. But she didn't belong in the clearing. She belonged out there, in the vast, untamed world that she had fought so hard to protect her cub from. Daniel took a slow, steady step forward. He wasn't sure what he expected. A final glance, a sign of recognition, some last gesture to acknowledge the connection they had built. But the mother bear didn't move. She simply stood there watching him, her dark eyes steady and unreadable. Then she let out a slow exhale, turning her head slightly toward the cub. A signal. And just like that, she took her first step into the trees. The cub hesitated. It looked back, just for a moment. Its wide, curious eyes locked onto Daniel as if memorizing him, as if trying to understand what this moment meant. Daniel couldn't move. The cub let out a soft, high-pitched whimper. Then, with one last glance, it turned and followed its mother, fading into the wild. Daniel stood there long after they had disappeared into the trees. The forest was silent, save for the distant call of a bird overhead and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was strange, really. The world felt exactly the same, and yet somehow everything had changed. He had always loved the wilderness. He had spent his life capturing it through a lens, seeking out its beauty from a distance. But this had been different. He hadn't just observed. He had become a part of it. And now, the part of his story that involved the mother bear and her cub was over. But somewhere deep in the vast stretches of the Olympic National Forest, they were still out there, living, surviving, thriving, more than just a story. That evening, the rangers prepared to leave. Jack patted Daniel on the shoulder. "You did good, kid." Susan, ever practical, simply said, "You were lucky." Daniel just nodded. He knew both were true. He packed his gear slowly, carefully. The camera that had documented so much of his life felt different in his hands now, because for the first time he realized some things couldn't be captured in a photograph. Some things had to be felt. As he zipped up his pack, he glanced toward the trees one last time. A part of him wondered if he would ever see them again. But deep down he already knew the answer. This wasn't the kind of story that had a neat, perfect ending. This was the kind of story that lived on, in the quiet spaces of memory, in the unspoken understanding between man and the wild. And for Daniel, that was enough. The Olympic National Forest was behind him now, but the experience still lingered. Daniel Hayes sat at the edge of his small cabin, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, watching the morning mist roll over the distant treetops. It had been 3 weeks since the mother bear and her cub disappeared into the wilderness. 3 weeks since his world had changed forever. The weight of choices. He had returned to civilization, but he wasn't the same. The news had spread quickly. The photographer who had risked everything to save a mother grizzly and her cub. Wildlife conservation groups reached out, asking for his first-hand account. His photos were shared across online platforms, sparking discussions about the fragility of nature and the delicate balance between survival and destruction. The rangers had praised him, but with measured words. "You did good," Susan had told him before he left, her sharp blue eyes watching him carefully. "But you also got damned lucky. A lot of people wouldn't have walked away from a situation like that." Daniel knew she was right. He had acted on instinct, on gut feeling, on a force stronger than logic. He had chosen to help when it would have been safer to walk away, and while it had worked out this time, he wasn't blind to how differently it could have ended. He thought about the moment he had thrown that rock at the male grizzly. A second slower, a foot closer. It could have been him lying in the mud instead of the bear. What the world took from it. Despite the risks, something about the experience resonated with people. His story spread. News articles called him the man who befriended a grizzly, a title he hated. He hadn't befriended her. He had simply been there when she needed help. Wildlife activists used his story as a symbol of coexistence, urging for stronger protections for grizzlies and their habitats. Some called him reckless, arguing that humans shouldn't interfere with the natural order. Daniel understood both sides. But in the end, this wasn't about debate. It was about survival. For the mother. For her cub. For a world that was slowly forgetting what true wilderness felt like. More than just a story. One evening, as he sorted through his photographs, Daniel stopped at one in particular. It wasn't the fight. It wasn't the moment the cub took its first cautious steps toward him. It was the last photo he had taken. A wide shot of the clearing, with the mother bear standing at the tree line, her cub at her side, ready to disappear into the wild. She had turned back for just a moment, her dark eyes locked on his lens. A final glance. A silent farewell. Daniel stared at the image, his fingers tightening around the edges of the printed copy. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a moment in time that would never come again. A new purpose. Over the next few weeks, Daniel made a decision. For years, he had traveled the world, capturing breathtaking landscapes, rare wildlife, and the unseen beauty of the natural world. But now he wanted to do more than just capture. He wanted to educate, to protect, to make sure people never forgot what it meant to share this world with creatures who had been here long before humans ever walked the land. He started giving talks at local conservation centers, sharing his experience. He worked with wildlife protection groups, using his photography as a tool for awareness. And slowly he realized this was always where his journey had been leading him. Not just as a photographer, but as a storyteller. One last visit. Months later, just before the first snowfall, Daniel found himself back at the cave. The place where it had all started. The place where, for a brief moment, he had not just witnessed nature, but become a part of it. The clearing was empty. No paw prints in the mud. No lingering scent of the bears that had once rested here. But as he stood there, surrounded by the towering trees, the crisp air filling his lungs, he smiled. They were out there, somewhere in the vast, untamed wilderness. Stronger, wiser, free. And for Daniel, that was enough. It had always been enough. Nature has a way of teaching us the most profound lessons. Not through words, but through experience. Daniel's journey with the mother bear and her cub wasn't just about survival. It was about trust, resilience, and the delicate balance of life. One of the greatest lessons from his story is that true strength is not just about power. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. The mother bear fought against impossible odds to protect her cub, reminding us that love, in its purest form, is about sacrifice and unwavering dedication. Daniel's decision to help despite the risks teaches us that kindness often requires courage. In life, we are often faced with moments where we must choose between what is easy and what is right. Helping others, whether people or animals, may not always be the safest choice, but it is the one that gives life meaning. Finally, as the mother bear disappeared into the wild, Daniel understood that some connections are temporary, yet they leave a lasting imprint. The people we meet, the moments we share, and the kindness we give, these are the things that stay with us, even after we part ways. Sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that change us forever. Daniel's journey with the mother bear and her cub was more than just an encounter. It was a testament to the unspoken bond between man and nature, a reminder that kindness and courage can transcend fear. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to share more powerful stories of friendship, loyalty, and resilience.